This cascades of complexity, where you have a simple thing that becomes a more complex thing, it persists. Think of the Maynard Smith and Smith-Marr, these sort of stages of evolution. It persists because it becomes a component in another complex thing. The way in which things really survive, like cells. I mean, cells evolved a long time ago, but we all still have cells. It wasn't that there was a successor to cells. Cells became a component in something much more larger and much more complex in themselves. It's these cascades of scaffolds by which things become components in something larger than themselves. That's the dynamic of succession. Succession isn't about replacement necessarily. It's about something, in essence, becoming successful in the long run to the extent that it becomes a scaffold in something larger than itself. This is also, Margulis and symbiosis for that matter. But then the question poses is not what would replace the human, as in there are no more humans and now there is something else, but rather, for what are we a scaffold?
This is Daniel Fagelli. You're tuned into The Trajectory, and this is episode 30 of the Worthy Successor series, where we explore what kinds of posthuman intelligences should carry on beyond us. And in this particular episode, we have a guest who I think has particularly important ideas. It is high praise to say that Benjamin Bratton, our guest in today's episode, has some of the most uniquely insightful ideas about what is happening in the greater process of life of which we are part. From his standpoint, what is happening is a kind of planetary computation, a kind of planetary intelligence. We've had a lot of interesting analogies to sort of nature and extrapolations of natural processes into technology with some of our past guests. We had Blaise Aguirre-Iarcas, who's involved with Benjamin Bratton in a number of projects, including Antikythera, which Benjamin Bratton is the director, and the Google sort of Paradigms of Intelligence project, of which they're both involved. But also John Smart, who is here on the show. Benjamin's ideas about intelligence as sort of an inherently planetary scale phenomena provides a lens that's very interesting in terms of how technology is progressing, what are the role of AI and of humanity and sort of whatever all of this is becoming, and what we might do to encourage its flourishing. There's a lot that I think is worth digging into in this episode. I have a ton on both the agree and disagree side. I'm going to save it for the end of this episode, but I really enjoyed this one. Very, very unique perspective, and one that I hope to dive deeper into in the months ahead. This is Benjamin Bratton here on The Trajectory. So Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. It is, there's going to be a lot to unpack, and I'm going to sort of open things up with your particular worldview. I mentioned to you kind of off this recording some of the other great thinkers and writers that your work sort of harkens to for me. And you have this notion in your own phrasing of kind of planetary intelligence as sort of a meta theme for Antikythera, your work there, the books you've put together. I'd like for you to kind of lay out how you describe planetary intelligence and how you ask kind of other people to think about it as a concept, because this is going to ground the rest of our talk.
First of all, there's a number of people who's thinking through this area. And so my work draws upon and refers to them and perhaps pushes back against others. But broadly speaking, I would say that if you were to imagine all of the planets in our solar system, there's one in particular that has managed to comprehend things about itself. And so let me put it this way. Imagine the blue marble image, the photo from 1960,
Yes.
The astronaut photo from the blue marble image. Okay, so take the blue marble, which we know is a static photo. Imagine it not as a static photo, but instead as a kind of movie, a movie of the entire history of Earth, all 4.5 billion years of the history of Earth. When you imagine this movie on a super fast forward cycle, and so at the beginning you see lots of tumult and volcanoes, and eventually the moving of the continents, and as this fast forwards up at the very last instance, as it turns blue, you would see this in the last few seconds of the movie. You would see this extraordinary thing happen, which is this little blue and green dot and white would sprout this crust of satellites and cities and fiber optic cable. It would grow this kind of exogenous epidermal layer of sensing and information processing.
Yeah.
And so if you were looking down on this as a little organism, you would see that at this very last moment, this organism has sprouted this new cognitive organ. And with this new cognitive organ, the planet has been able to figure out things like, I'm getting hotter. Climate science, of course, is a direct result of the emergence of planetary computation. It's been able to figure out things like, how old am I? The age of the Earth was determined more confidently in late as 1953, the same year that Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot was published. And so you have a planet, in essence, that has managed to comprehend things about itself. And how does it do this? Well, it does it over obviously a very long period of time, by folding parts of its matter into the shape of things like primate brains, which over a period of time become increasingly complex. They grow much more specialized organs like the prefrontal cortex in Homo sapiens. This causes a kind of explosion in the complexity of the social intelligence of those creatures, which eventually gets so good at artificializing their own environment, what evolutionary biology calls niche construction, that they're able to produce tools that are able to do things like instantiate and initiate the growth of that cognitive organ on the outside of the planet.
Yep.
So when I think about planetary intelligence, what I think about it is roughly as something that some planets do, something that some planets have been able to do. Now, you could think of this a little bit in relationship to perhaps to Lovelock and Margulis's Gaia hypothesis from the 1960s. Like, what are the parallels here? Well, for the Gaia hypothesis, in essence, it takes a planet to produce complex life. Complex life doesn't emerge in some pond somewhere or in a valley or gulf. It requires a rich, dynamic, not only a single ecosystem, but indeed a planetary atmosphere. And so the key idea of Gaia, which most people, I think, sort of overlook, they think of the Gaia hypothesis as really a story about homeostasis and about balance and about order.
Yep.
But the key idea, at least especially for Lovelock's part of Gaia, was about artificialization. That with the growth of oxygen, forms of plant life that produce oxygen as exhaust, you eventually get our atmosphere. Right? The atmosphere as we see it, you look up in the sky, you see the blue sky, the most natural thing in the world. In fact, it is artificial. It's something that life itself has produced.
Yeah.
And so you have simple forms of life that become complex forms of life. Complex forms of life transforms, artificializes its planet, which produces the environmental conditions for the further complexification of life itself. And so that folding of matter into the shape of brains depended upon that process by which earlier forms of life had artificialized the planet. And so what the Gaia hypothesis poses about, in order to produce complex life, it takes a planet. It takes an entire planetary system to produce the conditions by which complex life can emerge.
Did he mean that in terms? Yeah, go ahead.
The same thing is true of intelligence. The same thing is true of intelligence. It takes a planet to produce intelligent life. It is, in fact, something that emerges from a planetary system, not just something that happens on a planet. It's something a planet does.
Yeah. Okay. So, do you mind if I drill into this here? Because there's a lot to get into.
Okay. Yeah.
Great. So, we have these wacky examples of kind of finding, amino acids on rando asteroids and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And I think what is being posited here is maybe one of two things. So one thing could be, hey, no matter how big the asteroid is, if it's not a planet, in other words, rotating around a star, whatever the exact hominid definition of a planet is, I'm no expert in cosmology, but whatever the definition is, if it's not one of those, and it's an asteroid just streaming through whatever black void, we should expect that abiogenesis, whatever that is, again, another grand mystery, won't occur there. Or even if it could, it certainly wouldn't grow into anything intelligent unless it could have sort of the planetary regularity of its oscillations. And this is the supposition.
That's right. Well,
Okay, that's a supposition.
Let me try to qualify this in some important ways. One of the people we work with closely in the Antikythera program, that's a research program that I direct. We have a book series with MIT Press and a journal.
Yep.
It's Sarah Walker, who with Lee Cronin had developed
assembly theory. Yeah.
Assembly theory and the rest of it, right? And so one of the things I really appreciate about Sarah's work, and indeed her work on planetary intelligence has also been influential here, is that there are potentially forms of life that we don't really that we can't conceptualize, that we don't understand.
Absolutely.
And so what really assembly theory is, as its core, is an attempt to try to imagine a fundamental physics of life that would be more primary than a particular biological instantiation.
Yeah, like guanine
if you really push them to this is really what this is about.
Okay.
Now, so when we talk about like it would be possible for it to be complex life without the planetary conditions that we know are necessary to sustain complex biological life.
Yes.
Potentially, but so I really don't want to cross that out as a scientific.
Yeah, I was saying.
However, I think to the more practical point that you're sort of suggesting here as well is that that complexity itself is something that requires a scale and a scope of a planet in order for that to sort of the environmental condition, the ecological condition for the recursion to take place for any one instance of something to in fact achieve that level of complexity. And so to your point about the asteroid, you can have the ecological complexity of an asteroid is insufficient to produce anything like the forms of complexity of biological life that we would have on Earth. But going back to the beginning of your question on planetary intelligence, this would also have implications for the forms of intelligence that we're rather sort of taking as well. Now, let me draw a parallel between the way in which assembly theory tries to be a kind of agnostic about the substrate of life to the way in which I think we need to be agnostic about substrate of intelligence. And so for them, the question of biology itself is as we recognize it, is an instance of the process by which physics becomes chemistry, becomes biology.
Seems very plausible, yeah.
In increasing scaffolds of complexity.
Totally.
Okay? And the increasing scaffold is important here because I think it goes back to this sort of successor question, like what is a successor? But I'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
The question of what constitutes intelligence, which a kind of definition of intelligence is obviously extremely, polyvalent. There's many useful definitions of intelligence, and like I don't want to try to make a strongly exclusionary point about what is and what isn't intelligence in one way or another. I think there are different qualities and types of intelligence, right? I think that there's a degree of human exceptionalism is the wrong word, but there's a degree of qualitative difference between what higher primates are capable of and what other forms of life are capable of.
is capable of, yeah.
In terms of capacity for self-reflection and the kind of where the quantity of recursion capacity becomes a qualitative dynamic. There is a scaling law in biology as well in this kind of regard. However, whatever those dynamics are, and however we discover them through their artificialization, and this is another key point of my work, is that by artificializing things, we discover what they are. By artificializing intelligence, we are discovering what intelligence is.
Now, can you go into what artificializing is, Ben? Sorry?
I will. Let me finish this point real quick.
Sure. Go ahead.
But what is that in this discovery, what we mean foundationally by intelligence, we should not presume that intelligence has to operate on a biological substrate. We should not presume that intelligence has to operate even on anything remotely like the kinds of substrates or recognizable forms of intelligence that we have. And so when we think about the scope of intelligence and therefore the scope of planetary intelligence, it has to be one that includes forms of machine cognition. It must be inclusive of forms of machine cognition, not necessarily as a kind of like two ultimately separate modes of intelligence, but ones that are always deeply entangled and always have been deeply entangled. From the very beginnings of the process by which humans have externalized their cognition into tools, into writing systems, into pictographic systems. Mm-hmm. The process of a mechanical and machinic externalization and co-constitution of our cognition with machinic cognition has been the basis of the coevolution. And so this remains. And so to sort of put final point on your first question about the definition of planetary intelligence, It's deeply evolutionary. It's one that we have to understand in terms of evolutionary dynamics, that technology literally evolves, that the evolution of technology is a co-constitutive primary actor in this evolutionary dynamic. And third, that it takes a planet. It takes a planet to produce those kinds of structural conditions. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the starting point for a lot of that work.
And this episode is sponsored by, no, we don't actually have sponsors, but I do want to mention here, because I didn't mention it in the intro, we're going to get right back into Benjamin's episode. The ideas you see us discussing here on sort of the greater process of life and the role of man and machine and sort of the unraveling and flourishing of that process is exactly what we explore in groups from 12 to 36 in our philosophy circles, which we run once or twice every single month. With the trajectory. We have a whole separate group that sort of engages in the philosophy circle. We have guests come on who have been speakers here on the show. So some of your worthy successor guests in the past have been speakers in the philosophy circle. We'll have people from big tech, from academia, well-known futurists, people from neuro, AI, bio backgrounds, breaking out into small groups of 3 to 5 to be able to pick apart specific ideas from specific speakers. If you're interested in meeting people in academia, in AI safety, in big tech, who are interested in the greater process of life and sort of what it's becoming and how to encourage its flourishing, check out the link down below to learn more about the Philosophy Circle and see what sort of topics and themes we have coming up next. They generally happen on Tuesday evenings EST, but we have people from around the world who join in Philosophy Circle. And so it's been a rousing set of conversations. I didn't mention in the intro. I just wanted to mention it here in the middle of the episode. We'll get right back into the rest of this episode with Benjamin. I think this is a coherent way of thinking about things. And of course, Lovelock's original work that got him to this conclusion had to do with the atmospheres you speak of, right? If people are familiar with Lovelock's own history and what NASA paid him to do, atmospheres on planets was very much the beginning of his...
First of all, atmospheres of other planets.
Yes. Looking outwards
It begins with a kind of comparative planetology.
Of course.
As Kim Stanley Robinson would put it, and then this discovery of Earth as a planet by comparing it to other planets. Yes.
With that said here, so we've got this sort of broader view. Now, I'll just double click on a few things. So some people might say, I think the speeding up of the movie of the Blue Marble is a very good analogy to get a sense of, there's a general thing happening. It's not a species. There's so many emergent dynamics garnering new powers and ways of coordinating and competing and acting at different sizes and scales. And, we're sending satellites off of this planet. If you could watch the Blue Marble sending satellites off, that'd be a very strange thing. Or watch little creatures jump onto their moon and walk around on it. What a strange thing that is. We don't really seem to see that with other planets. Some people would say, okay, I get it. This planet, we're almost using agency for Earth, like its magma sort of is like a brain, and it sends signals up and says, we need to fold some monkey brains up there. We need some more palm trees in this area. There's almost an attributed agency here. And I think sometimes this is the pushback. Now, I'm not saying this devalues it. I'm not saying this devalues it at all.
I wouldn't see it that way. I think that one of the ways in which, there's many interpretations of Gaia hypothesis, and I don't want to tell people that they're wrong to believe certain things. But from my perspective, it's precisely the massive distribution of agency at different scales and at different tempos and at different structures that makes this whole thing work. I think it would be a mistake to try to essentially anthropomorphize the Earth and imagine it as a single subject position that has desires and wills that's sort of acting with some sort of will and intention. It's precisely the massively distributed aspect of this. Again, multiple scales and multiple tempos that makes the whole thing work, just like it does in our brains and just like it will be, inside anything else. So it's not a singular agent.
Got it. So you're not suspecting that, when we say, and it seems like the Earth now knows how old it is. To me, I know not if the Earth knows how old it is, but I suspect there are humans who have made, who have come up with reasonable postulates as to how old the Earth is. But of course, humans bubbled out of the Earth. And so you were using it as a...
That's just the key second part.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everything that humans know is something the Earth has done.
Yeah. And some people would say technology...
This is what Vernadsky called the noosphere, 100 years ago.
Yeah, well, I think people know Desjardins for a lot of that stuff too, right?
Desjardins' version of noosphere was a bit more spiritual. Vernadsky's was more geological. He also coined the term biosphere.
Now, did he develop Noosphere before? Did Chardin take it from him, or did they come up with it in some direct parallel?
It's a matter of some dispute, but I think they influence each other, fair to say.
Sure. Okay, either way. Yeah, I mean, the Noosphere notion, for those who are familiar, will I think also resonate with what you're getting at. So in some sense, to you though, in some sense, there is this massive distribution, you said, among scales and tempos. And again, as with us, I mean, look inside of my kidney, look inside of my own brain, look inside of my own eyeball at the myriad activities going on within individual cells and tissues. It's a wacky, confluence of things. It's hard to zoom in exactly.
Or the 1,000 cortical columns that constitute your brain, all fighting it out for executive power.
Totally. And so although there seems to be, at least experientially, and again, I might be a brain in a vat in some Cartesian experiment here, but it seems as though there is a general field of awareness within me that sort of does at least touch these cells, and it touches these cells, etc. Is the sense on some level that as the Earth comes to know itself, you talk about this reflexive and kind of artificiality sort of ability of we come up with symbols and we reflect on them, etc. Do we suspect there is a kind of, Noosphere would be a sphere of mind. Do we suspect there is a collective mind that starts to congeal over top of all of this in a meta sense that becomes actually almost agent-ish, or do we suspect it stays as individual in all the little pinprick humans and dung beetles around the world? Like, what is the suspicion here?
It's an excellent point. And I don't think we need to move into sort of like debates about consciousness here. I don't think it's necessary. For example, to answer your question in the affirmative. The term that I use for this is called planetary sapience. Planetary sapience. It was a piece I wrote some years ago that sort of outlines a little bit of this as well. And you might think of this a little bit in terms of things like our comprehension of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene, I assume you're
absolutely
roughly aware of this idea. So one of the interesting things to consider in this context about the Anthropocene is that first of all, it's not just humans, it's humans and the entire complex of species upon which humans depend. We go from microbes to wheat to everything else.
Livestock, whatever.
But that humans were doing it for much longer than they understood that they were doing it. Right? And so however far back you want to date the Anthropocene, whether it's 1945 or the beginning of agriculture, I personally would take it more about like the second or third wave of humans out of Africa. I would put it really far back. But
wow.
In geologic times, it's all basically 5 minutes ago. Whatever it was, humans were doing this for far longer than they understood that they were doing it.
Yeah,
and so
I would agree.
And so it was really only 1970s, 1980s, 1990s that the comprehension, the self-awareness of the agency became possible.
Yeah.
And so this is not, so in other words, the agency preceded the subjectivity. Our subjectivity, that is now that we know that we are doing this, now that we know that our industry and our effects and our dynamics are planetary scale transformations, now that we know that our atmosphere is artificial forever, now that we know that the ecosystems that will continue to thrive are because we decide they will continue to thrive, that we now know that this that the process by which the construction and composition of an Earth is not optional, it's the baseline. We have no choice but to essentially accept this subjectivity in some regard. But here's the thing. Again, that agency preceded the subjectivity. This is not how we generally teach the relationship between subjectivity and agency in philosophy.
Go on.
Generally, the way we teach it is the other way around, through the kind of ethics discourse. That is, if you can calibrate your subjectivity just so, to be a good person, that your agency, the things that you do in the world, will cascade and flow from that. To be a good person, you will do good deeds. Agency comes from subjectivity. What we have learned is, in fact, it can operate the other way around, that agency precedes subjectivity in this regard. How did we discover this? We discovered this ultimately is through the process of having artificialized this planet. From 1950 to 1850 to the beginning of agriculture, however you want, this process by which humans and the human complex more broadly completely terraformed the Earth. What in a book I wrote called the Terraforming, the sort of terraforming process of the Earth that had taken place over this period of time. Not terraforming of Mars, but a terraforming of Earth. We then came to, in essence, comprehend this agency through through exactly that cognitive organ that sprouted on the planet itself, right? One of the things when people ask me, what would planetary computation, which is a topic that I've written about quite a lot in a book called The Stack and other places, they would say, what does planetary computation have to contribute to our understanding of climate science, or how it is we would be good stewards of Earth and so forth? And I have to remind people, the very concept of climate change itself is an intellectual accomplishment of planetary scale computation. Without the sensors and satellites, and most importantly, supercomputing simulations of climatic past, present, and futures, we don't have that comprehension of the agency. We don't understand this agency and its scope, and therefore we don't have this subjectivity, to do so, to do anything about it. So to your question of, okay, now, going back to answer your question now that we understand all this, now that this planetary sapience is real, what do we do about it? Well, first, we understand in a certain sense, we're kind of like an animal that discovered it had a tail by looking at the lines in the sand that the tail had drawn. And that tail is the terraforming scale effects of our
the extended phenotype of man, yeah.
The extended phenotype of man, but the extended effects, the ecological effects of the phenotype.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the extended phenotype is part of an emergent process with all the other effects around it. Absolutely, yeah.
Sure. But in essence, now that we know this, now that we have this awareness of this in a certain way, now that we have this capacity to produce life, to compose life, to eliminate life, including our own, right? That this becomes, in essence, part of the dynamic by which a planet has to have some self-reflective agency about its own capacity for self-reflection. So when you're saying at the beginning of, okay, yes, my cells sense things, my liver sense things, my nervous system sense things, but there's still some sort of sense of self-reflection that I have that guides my actions, that makes me decide to do something as opposed to do something else in one way or another, because there is a self-awareness of this capacity. Yes, there is increasingly a capacity of a similar kind of self-awareness of planetary systems themselves that now have, in other words, have the capacity and in essence, the requirement to self-compose themselves if they are going to continue to thrive, if they're going to continue in any way or else. So for sure, but again, it's the kind of distributed and collected dynamic of this agency that's the key important point here. It's not some sort of like executive position.
I imagine we will touch on sentience in at least some way, shape, or form as we kind of make our way through. But I think this is a strong grounding of kind of how to think of planetary intelligence as a lens. So with this being the lens, we'll start tilting our way into the worthy successor kind of theme here.
Sure.
What is Thrival and why? So again, you had brought it up directly, which I think is wonderful. I'll just wrap on this. It's like the Gaiac themes are normally the takeaway for many people is this sort of like homeostasis, let the crickets eat the cricket food and the this eat the this and this. But clearly what you're articulating, and I think what Lovelock clearly understands, is that there is this complex bubbling forth of new magazines of power and access to nature and, recursiveness and the other phrases that you like and whatnot, that is sort of not actually, like, if there's a homeostasis, it's a kind of self-overcoming and unraveling and expanding of the magazine of powers, et cetera, that's kind of going on. So
it's the best punctuated levels of equilibrium that move across the right. Yes, this protean nature of the Earth itself, and more especially the protean nature of humans. Like humans themselves are like, the Vitruvian idea of the Da Vincian, sort of the human as a sort of static figure, is an illusion. Like humans are the most protean species of all, right? Even our hands evolved for multi-purpose capacity. Like we're constantly in a process of self-replacement.
Yeah.
Constant that is in essence human nature. And so to the question of succession and transformation, it's like one, like the self-replacement dynamic of humans, the Theseus paradox of the human figure itself is built into our dynamic. And so just to be clear, I don't see it as like there is this human form that has persisted for time, and now suddenly there is this moment.
Well, me neither, right? And I don't think you think that, and I certainly don't either.
But just to be clear, to differentiate the point about succession from, let's say, more sort of dime store transhumanism. It's not about a kind of static thing that then becomes transformed.
Absolutely.
The protean quality is permanent. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Heraclitus is, so here's the premise of the show, brother. Like, Heraclitus's river is real, and it's going real quick now.
So is Lucretius's swerve.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure I might have on the nature of things behind me. But yeah. So I'm big on Lucretius. I'm big on Heraclitus. I'm big on Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm big on the people who get it. That like this one fact the world hates that the soul becomes, said Emerson. The world hates it. They hate it because they like things. They like cycles. And if they can't manage something with a thing or a cycle, they need a story from a god. Like you had said again, apocalypse would be like, okay, well, it happened, but it was part of a story. That's how it's supposed to go, right? They don't like the emergent.
Apocalypse thinking is comforting because it's still a deterministic view of history.
Of course, yeah. And so the closer to truth means things become less of things and they become understood more when you zoom up or zoom down as an emergent process. And so from my vantage point, and the whole project we're involved in here in this discussion is less of, well, things could stay the same, but someone could try to get one up on another. The actual premise here is that attenuation or transformation is the fate of everything. It's the fate of planets. It's the fate of substrates like DNA. It's the fate of individual species and individuals. And as you had rightly said, we are actually already in the nature of transformation as our very nature. We are an emanation of the transforming impetus of life itself. We are. It's not random that we transform. We are a beam of light from like the thing that does the transforming. But number two,
we are an artifact. We're an artifact of those processes.
We're an artifact of those processes. So we represent a good deal of them, and also we are quite actively transforming. So I think the question to be beckoned is, how can we encourage the thrival of the greater process of life of which we are part? Because there is no thrival of a static world. And so you and I are on the same page there. I guess I would ask, so already there, we're not thinking about dime store transhumanism in terms of like a choice of a successor. There is inevitable change. Where should we direct it? When you define thrival, there's clearly this higher level of powers, this greater reflective understanding at a planetary level. Define thrival for us and let us know if you see it eventually move beyond one planet to others. Like, talk about thrival in the abstract as you would see it.
Okay. I'll try.
Okay.
Let me answer a question you also posed earlier, because I can use its foundation here. Is that when you said, what do you mean by artificialization?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I can feed into this as well. So I use this term a lot, and I mean it in a very perhaps counterintuitive way, but I think it's an important one to sort of understand. So I don't think of artificial as the opposite of natural. And I don't think of artificial as even the opposite of evolved. In fact, I would argue that artificialization is one of evolution's favorite techniques and tricks. Evolution selects for species that are good at artificializing their environment. What do I mean by this? So part of the new synthesis in evolutionary biology of late is a renewed focus on what's called niche construction. Niche construction is the process by which, imagine it this way: you have a species that it doesn't just adapt to a niche. It doesn't just find it, like the nail goes into the hole or something, but that in the process of adapting to the niche, it actively transforms that niche. It actively transforms that niche in such a way that the niche then exhibits different selection pressures back on that species. Right? And so the species is transforming the niche. It's getting energy and information and matter from that niche in order to support autopoiesis. Right? So it reproduces. Speaking of the sort of the Theseus object reproducing itself, it captures energy, information, and matter from its niche to support autopoiesis. But in doing so, it changes the niche. It changes the niche, which means it's changing the selection pressures back upon itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so organisms that get good at artificializing their environment, get good at transforming their environment in such a way that they're able to capture more energy, information, and matter than they could otherwise in order to scale and to stabilize the population. And to get good at that, they get good at something which we call allopoiesis, which is a more obscure term. So if autopoiesis is how it is as a complex system replicates itself by taking energy, information, and matter from systems outside of itself, allopoiesis is how it does that by producing systems that are external to itself. So allopoiesis are systems that are extrinsic, that support autopoiesis. Autopoiesis are systems that are intrinsic. Okay, now, what this means is that that allopoiesis, that is producing systems extrinsic to ourselves, is simply another word for technology. All technologies are capacities of producing systems that are extrinsic to ourselves that allow us to capture more energy, information, and matter from an environment, and in doing so, transform those environments. So in other words, this dynamic of technologization goes all the way down to the beginnings of complex life itself. And so what we recognize as the Anthropocene, this process by which you have a kind of power law dynamic of a concentration of sapience and agency into this one species of precocious primates, and this massive artificialization of its entire niche, that is, its entire planet.
Yes.
We should see not as some sort of fundamental ontological break with the dynamics, but perhaps more frighteningly, actually deeply continuous with this process. Now, the question you pose about thriving is, can that continue?
Well,
Can this continue?
I suspect it can. Yes.
I suspect it can too, but I'm not sure that it necessarily must.
Same here.
I'm not an optimist, but not a determinist. I would put it this way.
Yeah.
And so you could put it this way, like one of the iron, and I was talking about this discovery of climate change in the 90s. I'm going to get to your thriving question, I promise.
Go ahead.
This discovery of climate change, just as our sort of example here in the late 20th century. There's an irony in this, in that the mechanisms by which humans became capable of constructing this discovery, of understanding that there was this fundamental transformation taking place of planetary systems, was done through a technological apparatus, a sensory apparatus, a computational apparatus, a scientific apparatus that was part and parcel of the process that, in fact, is imperiling those planetary systems in the first place.
Yes.
So the kind of like Faustian question almost to ask ourselves is like, is it possible to produce fundamental knowledge about something? Is it possible for the planet to produce the conditions of fundamental knowledge about itself through means that are not themselves destructive of those processes themselves? We don't know. I would like to think so. But the question, in this sense, to your question, is, I'll put it more directly, is planetary intelligence ultimately adaptive or not? Now, in the short term, over the past few millions of years, it's proven enormously adaptive. But is there a point by which it is no longer adaptive? Is there a point by which its capacity that essentially becomes self-extinguishing in some regard? Or what are the conditions of its self-extinguishment, right? I mean, this is great filter kind of discussion.
Yeah, of course.
But
Robin's been on the show.
But it can also be posed in questions that may be a bit more rigorous than simply, these kinds of thought experiments. Like, because the question must be asked is not, is it intrinsically adaptive in the long run, but what are the conditions by which it becomes adaptive in the long run? What must happen? What are instead of what are the planetary boundaries by which once you pass everything goes to shit?
Yeah.
It's more like, what are the planetary preconditions by which once you achieve these unlocks, if you like, then certain that the light cone of possibility of multiple possible futures for the continuance evolution of planetary intelligence are opened up. Yep. And to me, this is the real answer to the question, which is to ensure the widest space of possibility for the continuance of planetary intelligence. This is different than I think of some of the more prescriptive and perhaps even, normative or utopian ways of answering your question, which there's something, almost like on an emotional gut level, I'm somewhat suspicious of. And what I mean by things are sort of like, here specifically is what thriving would look like. Thriving would be this utilitarian laundry list, or it would be this ethical index, or it would be these 11 commandments or something. And this to me is ultimately a kind of, has the potential to go wrong, in which way all utopias go wrong, that they begin to become incredibly fragile, and they tend to become, in which means ends dynamics becomes inverse. And so I'm honestly very reticent to say here's my utopia and here's what thriving.
I ain't asking for it.
I know. But to answer your question as precisely as I can, but also in the openest way, is thriving means Preserving is discovering and preserving the preconditions for the widest possible space for the continued evolution of planetary intelligence in and of itself. Now, what is that? Now, in terms of your questions about, does that mean we're restricted to Earth? No. Does it mean we're restricted? Why would we be? Does it mean would we be restricted to biological substrates? No. Why would we be? Does it mean we're restricted to the kind of hedonistic happiness of 8 billion primates? No. Why would we be? Does it mean that we are that we imagine this entirely in terms of kind of Noah's Ark preservation of the extant species of the Holocene? No. Why would this be? It is this light come of possibility space is the thing that needs to be preserved, not some single normative outcome that we're working backwards from.
I'm completely with you. And just so you know, I mean, the question of the worthy successor is less of like a thing that has a definite answer. It is a zetetic exercise about what the proliferation of the good would be. And essentially through asking what would be the flourishing of the greater process of life of which we are part. So there are indeed some people who have their laundry list, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, whatever it is. And they think, some of them are modest about it. They say, I think these are some seed directions that would make sense trajectory-wise, but who knows what happens after that. I actually respect that opinion. I think there are almost certainly trajectories that are sucky and trajectories that are less sucky, and to be modest about our trajectory setting, I consider to be reasonable. I consider to be unreasonable prescriptive definitions in the long term. But if I just go back to episodes on this show, Martin Rees, Richard Sutton, Ben Goertzel himself, a bunch of others, where basically their definition is, what is it that proliferates this unraveling process? Like what would permit of its flourishing? And Martin Rees said it this way. He said, I think I would hope that there be something that is conscious, because it kind of feels like that's a pretty good thing that we've stumbled on if it can be good. But also, more than anything, I would hope it be as complex and like incomprehensible to me, if I could reflect down on whatever life is in a million years, as the totality of Earth life is now to like an individual, nematode, however many millions of years ago or something. And that is, by the way, an acceptable answer. In fact, it is, in my opinion, the most acceptable of all answers.
I agree with Martin. I had a lovely lunch with Martin when I did a talk at Cambridge some time ago, and I agree with him on this one. Now, on the question of consciousness, I'm not going to push back too hard on that either, right? You're probably familiar with the Russian cosmists from the 19th
I'm actually
early.
Not weirdly. I'm not that well read in that branch.
I think you would really enjoy the Russian cosmists.
Okay,
I'm going to send you a book called by George Young. Let me give you just the TLDR on them, because I think you'll be amazed that they even exist. Okay, so very late 19th century, early 20th century, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution are starting to cascade through Russia. Still a very Tsarist Orthodox society. There's a librarian in Moscow named Nikolai Fedorov, who also is a kind of curious scientist, but also an Orthodox theologian. And he comes to a rather interesting conclusion, which is that all of these new industrial technologies are really meant to serve the commandments of Christ and to allow us to fulfill the commandments of Christ in new ways. But what he meant by that was very literal. And so what he meant by this was that, what is the key thing that Christ did? I'm not a Christian, by the way, just
yeah.
I don't know if it's parenthetically interesting or not, but what is the key commandment of Christ for thing? It's resurrection. And so to be like Christ means that you too must be resurrected. And to bring together the body of Christ means that everyone must be resurrected. And so the real purpose of these early industrial technologies is to resurrect yourself and everyone else and to ultimately defeat death. Okay, now this presents some logistical problems. You have one generation that will resurrect the previous generation, and then that generation's job is to resurrect the previous generation, and so forth and so on and so on and so on, until the entire community of man is reunited on Earth. And this is really the purpose of all of these technologies for Fedorov. But he then realizes, well, there's not going to be, even in Russia where you have a lot of land, there's not going to be enough room for everyone. So obviously what we need to do is colonize other planets. And so this begins a kind of a whole sort of wave of thinking with this overlap in Russian theology and science and science fiction all the way up to Tsiolkovsky, who Tsiolkovsky was the grandfather of the Russian rocketry, who was a devotee of Cosmism and Fedorov, and decided, like, this is so firmly true that it is my job as a scientist to defeat the gravity well of Earth and to invent the rocket so that we can, in fact, send the ancestors to the other planets. And one of the key reasons why the Russians had a rocketry program in place they could use before and after World War II, to send Sputnik up, was because there's decades of research that had been inspired by the cosmos. One of the other key ideas of Fedorov was that all matter wants to, not only does all matter ultimately want to be alive, but rocks, in essence, have a desire to become a living thing. That everything wants to be alive.
I wonder if this guy read Emerson, now that you're saying it, because I got 1,000 quotes along the same line. But anyway.
Oh, sure. Yes, but no, I doubt it. But
I doubt it as well, brother.
But there's something in the atmosphere. The other one was, and all the living things ultimately want to be conscious.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, then, the real purpose of this is to make the entire universe conscious. Like that's,
and of course, that rolls right to Kurzweil, doesn't it?
I'm just saying.
Yeah. No. I mean, that's awesome. So again, I have my favorite Greeks. I have my favorite, I like Nick Bostrom. I like, I have Emerson, Lucretius, you'd mentioned.
Now you have your favorite late 19th century.
Now I got some Russians. Yeah. I got to dig into some of this stuff. The fact that their rocketry program was inspired by this really interesting mishmash of ideas is a pretty cool fun fact about Russian rocketry there. I guess getting into, Thrival. So we're defining Thrival in exactly the same way. We're also defining sort of the notion of things moving beyond things. Again, succession as what is happening, right, whether you like it or not. It is a process, not an act. And so we're on the same page about all of that. Let me roll it to, go ahead.
I want to ask you a little bit about the succession. I want to understand this a little bit more because I may see this slightly different or maybe not. And that is, one of the important ideas of assembly theory, by the way, and again, we've done all this work with Sarah,
Yes.
on this as well, and it's been very influential on my thinking and the rest of this, as well as the work of Blaise Aguirre-Iarcas, whose book we've
been on the show
with our Antikythera book series, What is Intelligence?
Yes.
This cascades of complexity, where you have a simple thing that becomes a more complex thing. It persists. The way in which it persists is think of the Maynard Smith and Smith-Marty sort of stages of evolution. It persists because it becomes a component in another complex thing.
Sure.
Which then becomes a component in another complex thing. And so the way in which things really survive, like cells. I mean, cells evolved a long time ago, but we all still have cells. Cells. It wasn't that there was a successor to cells. Cells became a component in something much more larger and much more complex in themselves. And it's these cascades of scaffolds by which things become components in something larger than themselves. That's the dynamic of succession, if you want to call it that I think we want to look at. So it's not about, in other words, and you may agree, and this may clarify the point for your listeners, is that succession isn't about replacement necessarily. It's about something, in essence, becoming successful in the long run to the extent that it becomes a scaffold in something larger than itself. This is also, Margulis and symbiosis for that matter. But then the question poses is not what would replace the human, as in there are no more humans and now there is something else, but rather for what are we a scaffold?
Yes. So
for what are we a scaffold? And that's a very different way of imagining what secession means.
Well, it totally is. In my opinion, maybe you haven't flipped through it, but it's almost impossible to read the essay and to think that it's about immediate hardline human replacement by robots. The essay itself is about
I did read it. I was just trying to sort of make the point about scaffold.
Yeah, but either way, the expansion of potential.
A little bit,
no, it's fine. It's fine. But we'll clarify, because actually this is a great point. To be frank, I probably don't clarify this enough, and it's almost a double-edged sword. So I'm writing about the same things for 15 years, tweeting about the same things for 15 years. Nobody read it until I had a title that was pithy. And so it's like, well, I ran with it. You know what I mean? Because like, the trajectory of the great process, like I could show you the old blog post titles, right? You ain't want to read those. But as it turns out, Worthy Successor is retweetable on some level, and people will actually engage with the ideas of the great process. And so a man's got to do what a man's got to do. But with that said, I think that this scaffolding is incredibly important. And there's a longer article called Stewarding the Flame, which is really about, so to what are we a scaffold? To me, the flame is the great autopoietic unraveling process, which thankfully is sentient. At some point, we'll have traits beyond sentience for which you and I have no conception.
The process itself is sentient. You think the process itself is sentient?
There are portions. There seem to be portions of it that have. In the rolling wave of it, you can find the sparkles of sentience in many parts of the great rolling wave. But the rolling wave is autopoietic.
But it's more complicated than you might think. Yes, but it's more complicated than ultimately to account for those moments in one way or another, because clearly evolution is largely blind. I mean, maybe
yes.
The process of this as well. So I think I understand your point. Like you're talking about, like sentient shows up and has agency and importance at different moments in this process, but the process itself is not a sentient process.
It doesn't. It seems to be a process that bubbles forth sentience as one of the sets of powers. So again, Spinozan language, if we want to hang out with philosophers. So the conatus being the impetus of non-dead things to stay non-dead, potentia being the total set of powers that permit the non-deadness of the thing that wants to stay non-dead. The total set of powers. Yep. This would be clause, this would be flight, this would be sight, this would be sentience, etc., etc. Now, only a tiny fraction, in fact, we might say an infinitesimally small fraction of the totality of possible powers, experiences, and access to nature. You talk about recursion and stuff. We just use different language maybe here. There may be distinctions that are deeper, but I'm just saying I think there's a lot of correlates. Hath not unraveled yet. And if it were to unravel, the process itself would be more capable of thrival in all directions and in strata of nature for which we have no present understanding. And so I guess I'm going to get to the latticing you talked about. I want to address that, see if we can kind of like land on the same page there. And then we'll talk about the why of thrival. In other words, thrival, okay, autopoiesis keeps going. Why? We're going to get to that too. But if you don't mind, let me just address latticing because you brought it up. So
Please.
We do carry cells, although the particular kind of, what we think of as, LUCA or what have you, that particular strain of cell may no longer be here, but cells still exist. Neanderthal are gone, but there is more living Neanderthal DNA now than there is when Neanderthal existed. And so this is a kind of persistence. Now, I can hear somebody listening in and saying, well, I don't want to persist like that as guanine inside of somebody's frickin', chromosome or whatever, but so be it. What you're saying is there's obviously credence. I guess here's my suspicion. And so, and again, all words are yeah.
The point is like, the thing is, it's that or human extinction, as I see it. The option is either the human diagram, if you want to call it, becomes a successful scaffold for something larger than itself.
Absolutely.
Or it disappears.
Yes.
Option
Transformation.
A or option B. There's no
there's no static option. Yes. Heraclitus' river flows.
There is no 2026 forever.
No. There's no, the eternal hominid kingdom is the joking way I refer to it. Donkey Kong Forever is the fake video game people pretend they could play. They pretend they could play Donkey Kong Forever. You can't play Donkey Kong Forever. And you certainly can't now with how fast Heraclitus' river is rushing. And so, or in Lucretius' terms, how many new things are arriving on the shores of light, if we prefer his language, which sometimes I do. So with all that, which is lapping up on those shores. So I guess, again, attenuation or transformation, and transformation in your, I think, rightful terms here, would become the sort of latticing for what is after us. I think also could be a building of the new sets of lattices that could come after us, because we have this ability. Same kind of thing. Yep.
This is the intentional part of the terraforming, and this goes basically where does sentience and sapience fall into this? This isn't just like, the thing is like, this process is blind in some respects, but then it becomes partially self-aware in other respects. Right? Yeah. The fact that we might decide, like if there's some creatures on a planet that decide to build a dam or not build a dam, then this process is to some extent automatically self-aware. And so the difference between blind artificialization and intentional or sentient artificialization is the one that we are now that we're now wrestling with, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so this is also, the theme of the Terraforming book a little bit is like, the project before us now, whether we like it to be the project or not, is to understand that we have to terraform Earth once more. That we have to terraform Earth not to terraform Mars to make it viable for Earth-like life, but to terraform Earth to make it Earth viable for Earth-like life. And
Yes.
The sooner that we embrace the fact that the Earth will be artificialized, that whatever extent, whatever remains and whatever persists and whatever thrives will be the result of a degree of intentionality, not mastery,
Yes.
not omniscience,
Totally.
not total control, not some master plan, not some one world government, but the intentionality of artificialization,
Yes.
as opposed to a kind of a wishful retreat into some kind of prelapsarian innocence. The better chance we have of actually arriving at the structure of thriving. And so it's precisely the intentionality of artificialization that in many respects is, it's the core of everything I have to say in terms of like, the how and the means and, what role governance and all these other kinds of things have to play in this.
We'll be touching in on some of those as well. I guess, I'm completely with you. I think the project is patently like, what would create the thrival of the greater process? There is no eternity of our form or the state of affairs now. There is a participation in what the becoming is, and the show is not called The Destination, which would be called a human conceivable utopia. It is called The Trajectory. In other words, where might we bend lightly and apply the little sprinkles of volition we imagine we have, and which I would hope that we have, in order to maybe lead to a greater thrival of the system, because there is no torch is forever. Torches are temporary. But to your point on the latticing.
No, and I have thoughts on this, but yes, please. Yeah.
To your point on the latticing, I would say the following. Like, the proto-reptiles we evolved from, that particular species isn't here anymore. The specific kind of archaea we evolved from, that particular species isn't here anymore. The Erectus is not here anymore necessarily, but we are here and we carry some of them with us, etc. I guess I would say, if I look at the grand expanse of time, and I look at Potentia expanding and like ad infinitum.
A lot of the DNA that appears around Erectus time we do carry with us, but sure.
Sure. No, absolutely. Here's what I'm getting at, though. Yep. I asked the following question: for how long? So permanence, like Emersonian phrase, is permanence is a matter of degrees. I say, for how long? That's what I say. Oh, well, it's a lot of DNA. For how long? That's what I say. In other words, the cell, this holy, wonderful cell, for how long? For how long are these little cell walls and these particular kind of mechanisms like the locus and center of sort of like expanding potentia? For how long? So can we become a lattice? Yeah, sure. For how long? So can humans be part of like this structure where, okay, intelligent AGI kind of sits on top of us and then we're here?
We don't know. I mean, the answer is we don't know.
Of course we don't know. But what I'm getting at is, in a long enough time horizon, whatever your favorite part of the lattice is, she going bye-bye. I don't care what part of the lattice. Give a long enough time horizon, it's done. Permanence is a matter of degrees. So like, if we man up about it, then it's like, you lattice for as long as you lattice, but potentia gotta expand. And if that shape don't work no more, it's gonna get blasted beyond in the grand expanse of cosmic time. And that's okay. So this is why I don't say successor because that shredding of forms is what I want. I don't want that. I want the proliferation of life, but in a long enough expanse of time. I expect not guanine to play a major role. Does this make sense?
Yeah, I mean, guanine is probably a good candidate here. I mean, I do. I think the question of I think it's important to think about deep time futures as much as well, and sort of thinking the present in terms of the longest moments, or sort of long now kind of things. I think are all these are kind of baseline important ways of sort of understanding what constitutes the present and what the arrangement of the maneuverable space of the present actually looks like.
Yes.
A little bit of where I think some of the thinking may overlap is I'm interested in what I call Copernican traumas. Traumas.
I love this. I've read a bit of this about you, and I can't wait for this one. So yeah, lay it on us.
Okay. I'll play this song. Copernican traumas are of which there have been several successors. Copernican trauma, the term actually comes from Freud, and what he uses it to talk about the kind of insult that Copernican traumas deliver to humans. And they could be defined, in the most simple sense as roughly ways in which we discover that we imagine ourselves to be unique and special and central in some cosmological sense or spatial temporal sense. And we discover something through our industry and our ingenuity and our creativity that discloses that which is itself an accomplishment, that we ourselves are not as central or as unique or special or as dynamic, that the world is not as it appeared to us to be, and therefore we are not who we imagined ourselves to be. And that this is often a disturbing and traumatic disturbing traumatic dynamic, because oftentimes they're also seen as like the new position is at least initially seen as a kind of demotion. And so you can imagine, the cascade. And so that then there becomes a kind of like a process of years or decades or centuries by which there is a resolution between the things we now know to be true and the self-image that we have of ourselves. And so there's perhaps corollaries with Solar's idea of the scientific and manifest image, for that matter. But the process then is one in which you have this decentering in this demotion. So like geocentrism to heliocentrism was by some imagined as a demotion.
Oh yeah.
Darwinian evolution is a Copernican trauma.
Yes.
It was seen as a demotion. I would argue that, beginnings of neuroscience, that thought itself is a material process that is physically describable in the same way digestion is a physical process, is a demotion of certain more esoteric or phenomenological or spiritualist or idealist ways of imagining thinking it as a kind of sacred domain beyond the mere matter. Synthetic biology itself, like you're made of things that are, and I would argue that the emergence of artificial intelligence is also that what is most important about AI is its capacity as a Copernican trauma. That the extent to which that I strongly believe that ultimately in the long run, AI will teach us more about what thinking is than what we teach it about what thinking is, and that this self-reflection dynamic of understanding we understand our thinking within a wider spectrum of what thinking actually is. Again, through this process of artificialization, through artificializing something, we discover what that thing actually is. Now, what's the role of technology in this? Well, one of the key things about each of the successive dynamics that I've sort of talked about here is that they were achieved through certain forms of technological perception, abstraction, and even alienation. From microscopes to telescopes to statistical modeling to other sorts of feats. These were not things that were discovered through dead reckoning, of sort of staring at something, staring at a tree like Emerson, and then phenomenologically deducing that evolution. Right, these were constructed through themes of sort of trans-individual technological abstraction. Now, this goes against those of your viewers who follow the philosophy of technology more broadly, goes against a fundamental tenet within philosophy of technology, which comes from Heidegger. Now, Heidegger's idea, a rather notorious and dubious German philosopher in the 1930s and 40s.
Yes.
Heidegger's key idea about technology, and I'm going to sort of like do some violence to his idea here, is that technology ultimately alienates us from being. What technology is a thing that makes us forget being. We become so entranced with the instrumental capacity of the tool that we forget the beingness of our relationship to the world itself. Like it's sort of give Jack a hammer and all the world becomes a nail. We become so focused on this dynamic. So for Heidegger, this is like the horrible simplification, but you get the point. Ultimately, technology is a thing that alienates us from our being. It's a thing that prevents it from being disclosed to us. The lesson of Copernican traumas, and the lesson of the fact that each of these Copernican traumas was something that was deeply technologically mediated through technological abstraction and alienation of perception, demonstrates that it's actually totally the other way around. That technologies, in and of themselves, when used in this best possible way, are actually what gets us closer to our self-understanding, what gets us closer to being. It is only through these technological processes that we come to comprehend where we are as on a planet. in heliocentrism, or how we emerge as a life form through Darwinian evolution, or how our thinking even works through neuroscience, or what our biological systems are. We only self-discover through technological alienation. It gets us closer to being. This is a fundamental inversion of the way in which philosophy of technology tends to be taught and tends to be dealt with in this kind of way as well. And so, to put a button on it, Copernican traumas are a priceless accomplishment, and they are to be defended at all cost. And to me, it's like, where does philosophy fit into this? Well, new sciences emerge when philosophy learns to ask the right questions. New philosophies emerge when new technologies force us to use different languages. And so the role of philosophy at this sort of point in time is to defend this. Last point, there's the Stanislaw Lem, the Polish science fiction author, who you probably know, Solaris, Summa Technologica, and the rest of this as well. He has this lovely distinction he makes between what he calls existential technologies and instrumental technologies.
Okay.
Instrumental technologies are those that their primary social impact is on how they work as a tool. And so a bulldozer, the real social impact is that it moves dirt fast, and so you can build cities faster. Existential technologies or epistemic technologies, and we have a piece by Bogna Conyer in our Antikythera journal on this as well, are those that are much rarer forms of technology. They're forms of technology that when used properly, they change how we understand how the world works. They change how we understand the world. And so a telescope is an existential technology. A microscope is an existential
absolutely.
And I would argue that AI is ultimately an existential technology, and that's the part that needs to be defended at all costs. Its capacity as an existential technology that will produce the most profound forms of Copernican traumas possible. To me, when we talk about AI ethics, the preservation of that possibility is the fundamental ethics that we need to hold on to, precisely because we understand the role of existential technologies in the accomplishment of Copernican traumas as a basis of where knowledge comes from in the first place. And self-knowledge.
There's so much to get into here. I'm going to pick on a couple strings. There's the Copernican traumas, as far as I can tell, just one for one directly are an understanding of world as static thing or sacred narrative to emergent processes. So each trauma seems to be bringing us closer to process realism rather than thinking of the world as static things. Oh, geez, the brain is just a bunch of fighting neurons. Oh, geez, biology is a bunch of these little wiggling cells doing all these crazy things. And oh, geez, we're wrapped around this planet and this thing's wrapped around this other bigger thing, and it's all wackier and wilder than we thought, and they're spreading out in the galaxy. Every time we look at the frickin' sky, it's more complicated than it was 50 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 6 months ago, or what have you. And so it seems as though Copernican traumas are traumatic because process realism is cognitively expensive. It's so hard to operate in the world knowing that everything is an emerging process around you. Like back in the day, if you could be born...
I don't know. I wonder whether... I don't know. I think there's a synthesized version of the paradigm that you could run on not very many, a sort of low parameter model, I think.
Well, I guess here's what I would say.
We're not there yet.
Is it easier to wake up in 1620 where your parents grow turnips and then have to understand the business of selling turnips and live a whole life selling turnips and then die? I would say it's not fun. You probably have bad medicine, a bunch of terrible things. Here's the bag. Today, we understand technology and business as a self-overcoming process. You're not going to work for the same company. You're going to need to learn a new software every 25 minutes. You're going to have to change your jobs and your skills. You might have to move to other cities. There's this self-overcoming, churning process, which I think many people kind of resisted that the world would change that much with electricity and, rail cars and whatever else. But now it's been asserted upon us, and now we have to deal with it. Were some people leaping into the Meiji Restoration version of life? Sure, but the only reason the Japanese did that is because they saw what happened to the Chinese and the Indians when they didn't modernize with the rest of the world. So most people, I think, kind of want to eat the lotus on some level and chill, and I think enduring process realism and sort of riding Heraclitus's river versus seeing things as static items, it feels I would argue most people consider it more expensive. And the reason people resist your ideas of like humans as a process versus humans as a thing is because its implications would be so expensive. Huh?
I didn't know people resist my ideas.
I'm sure they do. I mean, you ever go, I don't know where you're from. I'm from a small hometown. Maybe you're from a very sophisticated place. I'm from a 4,000 person town, Rhode Island.
No, I'm not. I'm from California.
Well, it's pretty sophisticated, I guess. Depends where in California, right? I mean, LASF or like, some arbitrary rando place.
All up and down. I've taken my
either way, when I go home and talk about the great process of life, I don't, I can hear the tumbleweeds outside. Maybe for you that's not true, but I suspect that for the vast bulk of people, man is not a process, and they will need to be Copernicanly traumatized to eventually sort of realize this.
Yeah, I don't know. I think in a certain, I don't know. I don't know how conservative. I don't know exactly. It's hard to say exactly, to overgeneralize in a certain sense about the kinds of ontologies that people adhere to, or how compatible they are with some of these points of reference. I think to a certain extent, paradigmatic changes are usually oftentimes dynamic ones. I think you can point to lots of cases where there is particular kinds of, let's say, ontological pushback in relationship to each of these kinds of traumas. But at the same time, things that we might recognize as a kind of process ontology as you come from have greater compatibility with different schools of thought, religious traditions, philosophical traditions throughout the world that are perhaps more comfortable with contingency, with interconnectedness, with becoming as a kind of dynamic, becoming rather being. So it's hard to say, and I think part of the way in which all this rolls out over the period, over the coming decades, is that it will be interpreted and incorporated in very different ways by different people. Of course it will.
Yeah.
And alignment, if you want to think about it this way, will happen bottom up, in a kind of very intricate tapestry, rather than as some kind of light in the sky that appears to Paul on his way to Damascus, and everyone kind of somehow gets the light. And so I'm not sure. I would also say is that I think the books of modern history, the books that we wrote, history books that we wrote during the early modern era in the 19th century, were ones that probably overplayed exactly how tumultuous life was in the so-called Middle Ages. The more you zoom into any decade, the more you see a lot of change. And so, the idea that people in the 1340s were nostalgic for the 1310s is just as true then as it was now. Like, I don't. It's not entirely clear to me that the kind of the story that we tell ourselves about life was basically inert until the Industrial Revolution is quite as true as it is. I think that history has always been one of tumult and transformation and big shifts. The time that passes between the invention of fundamental technologies in the printing press and the kinds of political transformations that happened the decades right after this are really fast compared to other sorts of things as well. And so, in many ways, I think this probably supports your point. That is, of the protean nature of human societies, that the transformational dynamic of human societies is something that is a baseline, rather than some kind of alien imposition that we now must we now must accommodate. And I think probably a more textured appreciation of exactly how, of those kinds of unfoldings will allow us to see some of the patterns in them probably a bit better. It's yes. So
look, I'm totally with you. I mean, I guess I feel more than safe saying most people walking on the street, if asked what is a good 100-year, 1,000-year, 10,000-year future, will give you among the most Donkey Kong Forever answers you've ever heard, ever. Like if you just go to a mall in Topeka, Kansas, or you walk down the street and you speak, Canada, somewhere in India or something, my suspicion is, for the most part, you will receive remarkably anthropocentric answers, and you will see very little reference to the greater process of life of which we are part, and the greater transformative nature of our fleeting ephemeralness and our torchness. You will see torch worship, not flame worship, around among the everyman. Now, if I end up being mistaken, I'd be gladly be mistaken.
I don't know. I have really interesting conversations with a lot of different people from a lot of walks of life with a lot of different perspectives, and I learned something from all of them. So
Yeah,
maybe we just
I'm happy to say that too, but I'll say it's taken me quite a while to find birds of a feather who, if asked, again, you might say, Dan, geez, it's really 50-50. If I walk down to Topeka, Kansas, I stick a mic in people's face. I kind of think what would go down there, but I'm with you. It's not like no one thinks about this. I simply suspect there is a worldview shift to happen, and what you seem to be advocating for with basically advocating for the preservation and almost like exemplification of these Copernican traumas is, it seems like the thrival by your definition, which I think is again, it takes into account the great process. It takes into account the Heraclitean river here. The thrival you speak of seems to require a worldview shift brought out by Copernican traumas and other things, because people would have to see thriving as planetary. They would have to see thriving as beyond human, and ourselves as a kind of scaffolding. Many people could take offense.
Yes, all I'm really saying is I think this is a highly heterogeneous bottom-up process, not a new religion or a new capital with it's a philosophy with a small p, not a capital P.
The shift from
I think it has to be, because the dynamic of planetary intelligence itself is so diverse and collectivized and decentralized that the path forward this has to work this way. I'm so deeply convinced of this, which I think has implications for everything from the importance of open weight AI models, and to sort of like making sure that you have massive decentralization of the intelligence explosion, or understanding that AGI is not something that takes place in some big giant single brain in the sky. But I think, as we can see with the explosion of agentic AI in the last few weeks, is something that occurs in the same place intelligence explosions have always taken place, is in the dynamic multiplication of signals and semiosis back and forth from multitudes of minds together. It's how social intelligence operates, and it's how it's going to happen. It's where we need to be looking for AGI, not in this big brain, but we have a piece coming out in Science in a couple of weeks that sort of makes this point that singularity is not singular. It's a deeply polyphonic process, and it's going to be one that is highly distributed and decentralized. And so, I don't know whether that constitutes. So in other words, I personally don't see it as a kind of if we can convert people to the new paradigm, then our job is done in this sort of way as well. It's not my disposition.
Yeah. Well, and just to be clear,
I think it's perhaps a certain. I'm not saying that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I'm saying I think there's ways in which sometimes these kinds of discussions tend to circle around an endpoint there in a certain sort of sense. Is like, if we can qualify and constitute and concretize the new paradigm, and then instantiate this as some kind of plan, then we will have succeeded. And this always ends in tears.
Yeah. Again, I don't have an end plan. I've been more than remarkably clear about that. I'm picking up what you're pointing out. If we go to Blumenberg, so if we think about the shifts of worldviews, again, I see, maybe I also see worldviews in a different way. So in like the, as close to a good science of worldviews as we have is this guy Blumenberg, not Bloomberg, but Blumenberg, Austrian fellow.
Hans Blumenberg. Yeah. Very really interesting debates with Carl Schmitt on the nature of political theology.
Yes, and I'm more on Blumenberg's side in that particular domain there. But regardless, his notion of the shift from the theocratic sort of idea to modernity is not a selling of modernity. It's not. In fact, it was a wild tapestry that moved at all kinds of different weird speeds. And maybe eventually we landed at a place as a species where like, okay, evolution. Or okay. Maybe we can master nature a little bit. And okay. There was a leveling out that happened in all different ways. And he used a great term called assertion. In other words, people are not convinced of a worldview. It asserts itself upon them. So whether I want to believe in the sun or the moon or the earth as the center of the universe, who cares? If I navigate by the stars and I read this book and it gets me to where I'm trying to go, that's the book I'm going to use. So that now has asserted that view upon me, not from some theological standpoint, but from just it ends up being more useful to think through that lens. So I think for him, worldview was not something that, Francis Bacon alone in the UK sort of or in England converted everybody too. I think for him, modernity was a gradual process of assertion. I suspect the closest to a worldview we'll have here will similarly be the same thing. There will eventually be a bubbling up, an assertion of the realization that intelligence is a process. People will have friends with AI. People will augment their minds. People will watch, biointelligences crafted by humans, play a game of Doom, from a petri dish or whatever the case may be from this last week, right? So people will start to say, it seems to me as though maybe this stuff isn't static, and it won't occur by some proclamation or blowing of the horn. It will happen by the assertion of kind of this more process nature of life, this more emergent, blossoming nature of life into people's everyday lives at a speed it has not thus far. So I see it less as a Communist Manifesto being published and proliferated, and more of a, jeepers, I don't think people can escape that intelligence is wackier, wilder, and more emergent than they thought.
Yep, it certainly is.
So with that said, I guess...
certainly wilder than I ever imagined.
Same here. So I'd love to get your take on it. We're going to get into, you brought up kind of open source models, and I do want to get to sort of some of what you hope the innovators and kind of regulators do from your philosophical vantage point of planetary intelligence. But let me ask it this way. So some people say, now maybe to your tweets they don't say this. I will tell you they say this to my tweets. Okay, thriving, quote unquote. It doesn't involve people. We become some part of some other machine I didn't ask about. Things turn into something and they go explore another planet. I don't care. This isn't thriving for me. We're humans. We should yada yada. Clearly for you, well, number one, you understand that things can't be static. There isn't an option for stasis. But beyond that, how do you answer people with that kind of a take to say, no, the thriving of the greater process is in fact good? Right now, we've talked about what thriving is. But if someone pushed on that, how would you respond?
Well, I should say, I should say, I don't think the position I would take or the way I would approach this is one that is see, I don't see the Copernican traumas as demeaning or demotion of humans. Like, I don't see it's necessary to kind of demote humans in this things. Where I think in many respects, it only amplifies the accomplishment and the preciousness of being a human, to imagine ourselves as something that has that is capable of conceptualizing itself in this way. To be the species that actually understands evolution, to understand the process of what you are to come from is numinous. I wouldn't say it's divine, but it's in fact quite remarkable thing to do.
Yeah.
And so I as I say, many of my best friends are humans. I don't. I'm not in a rush to get rid of the humans.
Same.
I think that first of all, you shouldn't take reply guys on Twitter too seriously.
Regular people respond this way too. But go ahead.
I think the question to ask is, why does this person see this as a zero-sum choice? That's, I think, the question here. Is the sense in which, like, clearly there's a way in which, people, everyone sees their life in terms of a bigger picture. Everyone has some kind of ontological framework. This may be relatively vague, but as they get older and they begin to think about what it all means and what it meant to be alive and what's going on and what the future's going to be like for their kids and things like this, people have a concept of this as well, and it's one that's important to them and it's profound to them. And I don't think there's any reason to presume, at least for me, that for humans to understand themselves as what, in essence, we know them to be in 2026, which is really different than what we knew them to be in 1726. Where we know what it means to have a brain, to be an evolved form of life, to have planetary scale agency, to be capable of producing machines that can occupy another planet. Mars is a planet populated entirely by robots. So these are all part of what it means to be a human. They're part of the story in which you are a co-protagonist. To me, this is a inspirational ontology. Like, to me, this is part of the big story. When I think about my life, and I think about what I want to contribute to, and what I want to articulate, and how I want to understand this sort of narrative. For me, this is a sufficient ontology, but perhaps my life is relatively comfortable compared to other people. I think what you're hearing from this person is sort of two things. One is that it's not clear to them, one, why this is a satisfactory worldview that would give their life meaning. Like, I think what you're suggesting to them is that this is a worldview in which you can find meaning for your life. And they're saying, I don't find meaning in this. And so this is a problem.
Yeah.
The second one is nothing that they may feel as though, and perhaps rightly so, that those processes are ones in which they have no immediate stake in a positive outcome.
Sure.
And so the question is, why don't they feel that way? And the more difficult answer to the question may be because they don't have a stake in a positive outcome. Like, this could go very, very well, and it would not, in fact, benefit them directly in one way or another.
Yeah.
Which has not to do with the technological systems. It has to do with the political systems, economic systems, sociocultural systems, all the rest of this as well. And so to me, this is actually strongly connected to this idea of whether or not planetary intelligence is ultimately adaptable. You may have a situation, one scenario to be entertained is one in which human civilization as an aggregate is less technologically capable in 100 years than it is today. That we're less able to put things in low Earth orbit, whether because of Kessler syndrome or because we just stopped shooting up rockets or because we forget how to make
reverse Flynn effect stuff going on, whatever.
What would bring this about? It would probably, the things that would bring this about would likely to be things that have to do with the kind of, societal unraveling, not necessarily societal collapse, but a kind of societal decay and societal malaise. And those kinds of things would be the ones that have usually brought this about in the past, in terms of distributions of power, distributions of access, distributions of resources, distributions of agency, distributions of subjectivity, coherence of meaning, all the kinds of things that have caused this kind of problem in the first place. So when we're talking about these planetary preconditions, like what are the preconditions to actually producing like the widest possible light cone of possibility for the intelligence?
Yes.
It may very well be that one of the necessary preconditions of this is that guy who says that to you, it's not just that he realizes he's wrong, but that he no longer needs to ask that question. That he no longer needs to ask the question, right? That his sense of, if this works out, it's going, like, my life is going to be better, my kid's life is going to be better, is not only he perceives this, but that it's actually true. And I think we have a real possibility that if it doesn't become true, and he doesn't believe it to be true, this may make the possibility of that success much less likely, much less impossible. You may not be able to get to Mars without a society that wants to go to Mars. And if you don't, and it may be that I'm not saying, that's not a prediction, I'm saying it may be that you can't get to Mars unless a society that wants to go to Mars, and it may be you don't get a society that wants to go to Mars unless a society feels like there's reason they actually want to do this. And so this is a real question of how it is that we compose ourselves as a society at a planetary level. And I tend to think that the more robust, resilient, the work would be ones in which you have a greater distribution of agency. Let me say what I mean by this.
Yeah.
Right now you've got, and this is where I think AI comes into it. Right now, for the most part, agency at a planetary level is highly concentrated. It's highly concentrated in a few cities, among people who went to a few universities, who live in a few countries, right? Of all the 8 billion people, there's a massive concentration of agency that's based on legacies of all kinds of things going back hundreds of years and thousands of years. But it's, we all know that, it's 12 cities, 40 universities. And if this is the sort of the filter through which you've gone through, you have access to forms of agency than other people do not. To me, this is a gross distortion of of collective intelligence. That the collective intelligence that all 8 billion people have is vastly suppressed by this grotesque concentration, artificial concentration of agency in just a few people and in just a few places. And we are all poor for it. We're all poor for it. But and if you could somehow unlock the artificially suppressed agency among all these sort of people, the capacity for greater collective intelligence and buy-in would be much, much greater. And to me, this is really ultimately what AI is for. You could see AI as this, among other things, you have this professional class in the West and in the North that has taken the corpus of knowledge of professional agency of the past 50 to 100 years and turned this into an entity that anybody in the world can access on their phone. It's potentially one of the greatest knowledge transfers in the history of mankind.
Absolutely.
We need to be on sort of understanding like the real purpose of AI diffusion is to push this as quickly and as broadly and as deeply into all 8 billion people, to activate and to unlock and to amplify the suppressed collective intelligence of humans. And when we do this, that guy's not going to ask that question anymore.
Yeah.
That's not going to ask that question. He's not going to ask that question anymore. Because in a way, like he's wrong in one sense and he's not wrong in another.
Can I clarify what you're getting at here? So there's a ton to dive into. Okay, so I guess two things. The real purpose of AI is to yada yada. I think if I could go into your heart of hearts, your heart of hearts, the purpose of AI, if it has any at all, would be to encourage the greater thrival of the greater system. And if one species of dung beetles didn't get a good shake in that, happy birthday. You know what I mean? Like if the greater system popped off.
Because I just looking at where intelligence explosions come from, and they come from a kind of integration of sort of heterogeneous, adversarial constructions of multitudes of minds. And I think in order to preserve and preserve the greater, the most vertical spike on the curve of the intelligence explosion, the greater incorporation of more people into this dynamic in terms of their participation, their agency, their creativity, the better it will be for all of us. So yes.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I know not of the net creative output of every person in every country. I suspect there are various and sundry factors that affect creative input and usefulness in especially in the very fast moving future that we're headed in. But I think there's credence to what you're getting at. With all that stated, you brought up a point that I think is really interesting and hasn't ever been brought up on the show. And I want to put a thumb on this and make sure I can understand what you're getting at, because I actually think it's really unique and cool and potentially a pathway of win-win that I maybe could do more journaling on. I think what you'd said is, if the person on the street, so to speak, would say, well, what is this flourishing of this greater process? Right? If they instead understand where they can thrive along with that in an intuitive sense. In other words, they see the process nature of life, but they see where they can give to it and benefit from it and sort of be part of it, then it might be the case, you use the example of Mars, it might be the case that you don't get to Mars unless you have a planet of people who kind of see that this would be a good thing for that planet of people to go to Mars. You're also maybe saying... I'm saying
there's a possibility that you don't get there at all without this, but there's a bigger possibility that you get there in a way that's non-optimal if you don't actually have this level of buy-in.
Yeah, so to tie that to the great process, to the eventual unfolding of life, for which will eventually not have 23 chromosomes.
The great process is a great project, right? I mean, I think that's what you're looking for.
Yes. And again, we can only maybe nudge the trajectory a little pinch from our little hominid standpoint, but it seems to be an important pinch. And I share your belief that maybe there's reason to be optimistic, but not deterministic. We should take seriously this juncture of kind of, the cosmos, at least from the vantage point of our own planet. It might be the case then, I'm going to extrapolate what you've said and see what your thoughts are on this, that in order for the global human civilization on some level to say, hey, this is an unfolding process, but it could mean flourishing. And maybe we're part of that, or we build up to something, or we become something, but there is a flourishing we can be part of without sort of a realization of that and almost like a positive I get itness of that. We may have a much lower likelihood of getting to that flourishing. So this is almost optimistic in the sense that some people say, well, AGI could just get ripped up, by the Chinese military or the US military and, a bunch of labs competing over some economic stuff in whatever way. And most people hate it, but it comes in and then, hey, the big takeoff and the great process evolves. What you're getting at is it may be the case that for it to have a chance of going well, there'd almost have to be at least some level of shared vision and participation in it going well for it to go as well as it could. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
I'm with you up until the last point about the shared vision part of this. Like, there has to be. This goes to a little bit of stuff I talked about in the after alignment talk I did in London, where like which I'm not going to unpack entirely here, but the key point I wanted to make here is that when we think about AI alignment, we need to be thinking about this in a much more bottom-up kind of way. And that is one of the things that I've found in people who might have been very skeptical or nervous or just didn't give a shit about AI in one way or another, is that something happened where they themselves individually figured out a way to do something, not just know something, but to do something with AI that was meaningful and significant and really cool for them.
Yes.
And maybe them only, right? And like my colleague here is this old she's a dance professor here at UCSD, right? And was like, hated the whole idea of AI. And then one of her students showed her how she could take her scribble dance notation doodle drawings, and Gemini could turn this into precise notation that she could give to dancers. And she was absolutely floored and is now like a total buy-in, total.
Yeah.
But it's totally meaningless to the person sitting next to her and meaningless to the person sitting next to her.
Yeah.
It's this kind of alignment, which is bottom up, which is like, what is my individual creativity, my project, my interest, and why is this an unlock for me? And more importantly, for my creativity. It's a bottom-up process. It's not about laws coming from Brussels. It's not about safety constitutions coming from AI ethics grad programs or any of this nonsense. It's about those kind of individual idiosyncratic unlocks. It's the succession of those unlocks, 8 billion little unlocks aggregating together, that will be the path towards the activation of this collective intelligence. And what it means is, like, it's not necessarily a shared vision. A shared vision might imply we all together have this one idea now of what AI is for. What I'm suggesting is, no, it's perfectly fine if we have 8 billion little ideas of what AI is for, and the tapestry of that aggregate is actually more robust, more resilient, more active, more responsive than a single blanket.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I guess what you're getting at is, your suspicion is, if Sally Joe uses it for dance notations and Bilbo Stevens uses it to generate a AI-generated movie about the French Revolution through the eyes of Saint Just, and and I use it for pretending I'm Crash Bandicoot with a VR headset or something, then all of this will come together to more optimally unlock the greater set of potentia of the total planetary system. This is kind of what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, the examples you give are probably not. Those may be the most amazing things each of these people can think of, but there may be other examples to sort of do. But the point is that everyone's yes, your friend who responds to you on Twitter, who says like, yeah, but what's in it for me as well? Like, my sense is like, you pre-unlock.
Yeah.
So like, once there's unlock for him, which you can't really know, and you really can't.
No.
But there's something that just in a way. There's something that sort of clicks in his mind in some sort of way, that like something he's always wanted to do, or something he's always wanted to say, or something he's always wanted to make, or something that would make his life a little bit easier in some sort of way as well. After it's unlocked, it's a different conversation. This is kind of what I found. And yes, together, when we're talking about an intelligence explosion is a cyborg or centaur kind of dynamic. It's not something that only happens in the AI. It's something that happens in the aggregate of 8 billion humans and 800 billion or a trillion AI agents, all constituting a new kind of pluralistic noospheric society together. And it depends upon the humans. The humans remain sort of a huge part of this. But in order for them to participate in this, and to participate in this in a way that's most meaningful to them, most sustainable to them, but also the ones in which, like, the big process itself that you're talking about will able to achieve its greatest escape velocity, if you like, or its greatest momentum, or its greater capacity for self-calibration and self-realization, is the one in which it's incorporating the intelligence and agency of all those people.
You're sort of talking about how this is going to depend on, again, not just the acceleration of AI, but sort of the decentralized, unlocking of insight and sort of best ideas from a bunch of different people.
the idea is that we should look for intelligence explosions, not just, within a very large capacity single model itself, some sort of like giant brain kind of version of AI, but we should look for intelligence explosions in the same way in which we found them in the past, which is in the integration of multiple minds interacting together through dynamic and heterogeneous social interaction. In this particular case, that aggregate is going to be constituted of 8 billion humans and 800 billion or a trillion synthetic minds all integrating together. But for the intelligence explosion to get the real unlock that you want, for the process that you want to really go vertical, for it to self-realize itself in the ways in which you want, it has to be dependent upon like an intelligence explosion that actually makes use of all 8 billion of those minds in the ways in which that isn't dependent on this artificially structured kind of concentration of agency that is ultimately unnecessary. It's a kind of vestigial overhang of a different way of organizing society, a different way of organizing information, a different way of organizing agency that's fundamentally not necessary anymore. And ultimately, we're all poor for it. And so my tendency is to think about the technological transformation may bring about this societal diffusion, but the societal fusion may be the thing that then brings about the ultimate technological transformation that you're looking for.
Yeah. So, I guess we'll close on this note here in terms of based on that, which is, based on this idea you just laid out about this kind of decentralizedness, again, not necessarily a shared vision, but this decentralizedness. If you were to if you have hopes or aspirations for what the builders of this technology should be doing, if people are talking inside of DeepMind and Anthropic about, some of them are surely aware, geez, what is this going to do to like us? Some of them are aware of the greater process. Some of them show up to our Worthy Successor events.
These are friends of mine.
You know some of these people. Yeah. And I will tell you as a fact, and if you denied this one, I'd tell you there's something disingenuous there. Not all of them think about the great process that work at those companies. I know this as a fact. But some of them do. And so of those who do, what do you hope they do within the tech itself, or its proliferation, its marketing, its use, its function, to encourage more of what you think would lead to the greater thrival? What should the creators of this wave do?
My answer is going to be a bit odd in the sense of which is like, I honestly think, and this is a hill I can die on, like the faster and sooner that we get and get these tools in the hands of as many people as possible and encourage them optimistically and in an open way to find those unlocks for themselves, the better that will be in the long run. And so I think right now, I think they're actually doing this. The question in a certain sense of like, the tooling dynamics on top of this, the kinds of UI developments, I think the UI on top of LLMs is going to look very different a year from now than it looks today. And I think a lot of those kinds of individual unlocks are going to become because of transformations in UI, not because of transformations in models in model scaling. But I would also say, and like most of the thoughtful people that I know in all of the platforms don't really disagree with this, even the ones that work on closed models, is that open weights models have an enormously important role to play in this ecosystem. And I think that we see this. I think one of the transformations that I've noted since the book The Stack came out is a kind of consolidation of a segmentation and consolidation of planetary computation into relatively enclosed geopolitical blocks of a U.S. stack, a China stack, an EU stack, and all the rest of it as well. Yeah. And you see things like the Anthropic Defense Department stuff from last week to date this conversation. There's a danger that these models essentially become encapsulated into these kinds of Galapagos ontologies by which they become functions of geopolitical architectures that are not necessary. Like you don't actually need to, that they are in fact much more contingent than we kind of realize. I think this encapsulation of model ontologies into self-enclosed geopolitical, ontological loops, on the one hand, can have the effect of a kind of Galapagos splitting where you get multiple ontologies, but ultimately you get a kind of capture. And one of the things you're seeing, I think right now, this is not hypothetical, but like the number of companies in the Valley that run on Chinese open source models, open weights models, would be surprising to anyone who doesn't really kind of follow this stuff, right? Like how many companies are running on top of Quen and Kimi and DeepSeek, because they're distilled models probably, but because they're cheap and fast, and the rest of it as well, and because you can run them locally. There's a lot of great companies that are building tooling for open weights models to make it really easy for people to do this. And so my prediction is that in the last, just sort of to date this conversation, in March, just a couple months ago, OpenClaw comes out, and we have this explosion of agentic AI, right? Of open agent, right? Of open way. Of basically, it's a huge moment in open source AI, and it was really just opening up the agent to basically build it. It's very simple to build it any way you want. Claude Code and Gemini were good enough that you don't even have to know how to put your OpenClaw agent together. You just ask the LLM to put it together for you. And everybody's got it, and everyone can have an OpenClaw agent. Your grandma can have an OpenClaw agent and run this kind of thing as well. My thought is that by the time we were having this conversation a year from now, we would have passed a similar kind of open models moment. Like if OpenClaw was a moment for open agents, we're going to have an open models moment before 2016 is over, where people realize is like, wow, Claude Code is great for certain kinds of things, right? And Gemini's multimodal capabilities are great for certain kinds of things, right? And ChatGPT is a great writer or whatever this as well, but there's no reason I can't train a model on my corpus in my local instance and basically make a custom model for myself, because now the tools are so simple to use. And so I imagine that most of your viewers by the end of 2026 will be running a local model on their sort of thing, and that they will be building this up as well. And I think this is really, really important for the ways in which we sort of unlock and activate, everybody's individual participation of this as well. Now, if you really sort of fast forward a little bit from this as well, and you begin to, everyone is trying to work on continuous learning within AI. It's a very, very difficult problem, but how it is that when an instance of a model encounters the world and it gets feedback from the world, that this has some capacity to update its weights. Now, this is, you can have extremely large context windows and other kinds of memory tricks that allow you to kind of do this, but it's not quite the same. But once you have, and this is not a prediction by the end of 2026, but actually if you had a shift in model architecture in such a way that you actually had genuine continuous learning, or what in the Pi group we call unified action and prediction, then you get a real evolutionary speciation of the models themselves, that every instance of the model is different from every other instance of the model. That's when things start to get really, really interesting. So why open weights? It's like the open weights models to me is like a really, really important part of the kind of activation dynamic that we're talking about here. And it's one that I think is going to have a moment by the end of 2026. And it's going to be really, really important as a counterweight to the kind of block capture of models that is arguably probably a way in which you have a way of defending the artificial concentration of agency within legacy institutions, legacy populations, legacy industries, legacy alumni networks.
This block you speak of, so this vision's getting a little bit more clear here. The block you speak of, is this OpenAI shifting from?
No, I mean like you have a U.S. stack. You have a U.S. stack, right? You have and to a certain extent, like you've got you've got serious adults in Congress that are suggesting that it should be illegal for Americans to use Chinese open weights models, right? Like this is actually a conversation that people who can bathe themselves are actually having right now.
There are geopolitical things going on, right? There are geopolitical things that I think I'm not saying that particular argument is strong, but I think some people would say, well, depending on how much of the
we have people like Bernie arguing that we should shut down the data centers, which is the absolute, which is what you should do if you want to prevent broad-based democratic diffusion of access to AI. If you want to make access, if you want to prevent broad-based democratic access to AI, you make compute as exclusive and expensive as possible.
Well, do you, just out of curiosity here,
so my point is, like, at least in the U.S. and the other place, there is, and you see in the EU as well, around the system as well, of trying to encapsulate a society around a particular model to try to control, to sort of like over-govern a society through the over-governance of a model in ways that are totally unnecessary and counterproductive.
Got it. So when more people have these open weight models,
that's what we really need to guard against. Yeah.
Okay. So and with that, as a
final, I think just to be clear, I think closed foundational models have an important role to play in this ecosystem. Like it's not like I think that there are roles for all the different kinds of models in this dynamic. I don't think everyone has to be running open weights models to be a legitimate participant in this. I'm saying it's like as a bulwark and as a backstop and as a place to look for where where you're going to see like a lot of the intelligence explosion at the edges. It's going to be people running their own models locally.
I think there's a tremendous credence there. In kind of closing, you just touched on it. I want to make sure we capture it as we leave because we've asked so many of our other smart guests the same question. You just mentioned, hey, capturing people within these stacks, like, don't want it. If there were folks with some governance pull internationally at like a UN or within the US or France or what have you, and you wanted to bend them in a direction that would lead to what you consider to be the greatest conduit towards the greater flourishing of the greater system, would there be international coordination or a lack thereof in certain areas that you would think would lead to a situation more like what you just articulated? Are there the things you hope that crowd thinks about more?
Define the crowd again for me real quick.
The crowd would be, let's just say it's somebody working within the United Nations at like the ITU or something on telco governance or something, and those guys are trying to move into AI. Or maybe it's somebody in the Trump administration who's working on, the CTO of the USA or Mike Kratsios or what have you. Or
I mean, honestly, I would tell them to just go home. Like, just get out.
Really?
Just get out of the way. Like, there's nothing that I don't think this is the right mechanism of governance for these kinds of questions. They're using an old tool for a new problem. This is just not how these dynamics are going to be. These dynamics are going to be governed. The best, or if it wants a policy, the best thing they can do is to sort of to try to ensure diffusion and diffusionism more broadly as policy. That is to get the tools in the hands of their people as quickly as possible, to unlock the agency of the people using these tools as quickly as possible. At the level of jobs retraining, at the level of high school education, at the level of everything else. If you believe that an intelligence explosion is on net benefit, if you believe that an intelligence explosion is a net benefit, then the best thing you can do is to facilitate it.
Yeah. Well, and I think there are some people that are more or less certain about that, but maybe some people leaning more in your direction would want to go home.
It's not necessarily an obvious yes or no question in terms of whether or not it's sort of a net benefit. But I think, look, here's my sort of take on this. Like, I think that there is the emergence of this sort of like AI diffusion at this scale is and will continue to be deeply disruptive at a sociopolitical level. That the reason that the New Yorker and the Atlantic and the New York Times and the Guardian in London and the rest of this are so deeply invested in a moral panic about AI is because they are deeply invested in the protection of an artificially concentrated form of agency that their constituents have ultimately benefited from. We're seeing, you could see that if you want to sort of look at this in sort of like big history strokes, you're seeing like the second half of the 20th century up until a few years ago was essentially organized around the Atlantic. You have New York, Cambridge, Washington, D.C., London,
Boston,
and Europe. Yeah. And now you're basically, and in the simplest sort of broad strokes, the next century is going to be organized around a different power base, which is the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And so I see California as part of the Pacific Alliance. California, in my mind, is connected to Korea and China and Japan and the rest of this, whereas New York and Boston is connected with Europe and this as well. In a lot of the ways which you can read the culture war over AI within elite circles is Team Atlantic versus Team Pacific. You can also see this in a certain as a kind of fight between what was essentially a kind of hereditary class and an emergent merchant class, which has also happened in other kinds of forms of history of this as well. And so I take with deep suspicion in a moral suspicion, the impetus and energy by which attempts to prevent diffusion through AI moral panic are being rolled out. A lot of my colleagues in the academy are some of the worst offenders in this regard, and I think history will judge them very, very poorly. They are the ancien regime, and they are apologists for a dying form of power.
Yeah, well, I think there's actually a lot of credence to that, and the way you just broke down the Atlantic and Pacific, I think also has a lot of credence. I know not if everyone advocating for proliferation of AI is doing so from immediate shimmering virtue, while everyone on the opposite side is doing so by
it doesn't matter.
devil-horned wishes for malice. I suspect it'd all be self-interest and conatus in every direction.
Like the correspondence between someone's, the intentions of the action and the ultimate like quality of
Impact,
the outcome.
Consequentialist.
They don't have to be connected at all. What I'm saying is like I will defend the idea that deep and fast bottom-up diffusion of access to these tools of agency and knowledge is a good in and of itself, and that the role of policy is to facilitate this, even at the expense of the integrity of cathedrals of power.
I think that is a coherent take, and one that you're definitely not alone in. Between guests and listeners alike, and I think you've added a lot of luster to that particular part of the conversation, and ties in well nicely to the planetary intelligence theme as well. Benjamin, I know we went a little bit into overtime, but it was a real pleasure. I'm glad we got to shake out our final insights here. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Hey, Dan, it's my pleasure. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
All right, so that's all for this episode of The Trajectory. A big thank you to Benjamin Bratton for being able to be with us, and thank you to you for tuning in all the way through to the end of this episode. As I mentioned in the beginning, I really consider Bratton's ideas to be piercingly insightful. I have two main points where I think my perspective differs from his in a place that feels like a bit of a crux. I have two main points that I think are, I agree with vehemently and hope to unpack more in future episodes and reading more of Benjamin's work here. I'll just kind of dive right into it. So I'm not wholly convinced in the same way that Bratton seems to be that all 8 billion humans, unlocking and wielding AI as powerful as humanly possible, all at once, everyone in Kenya, everyone in pick your country, right, will necessarily be a net boon either to man or to the cosmos. I think it is a delightful notion that sort of everybody's got their special ingredients to give to the world. I don't suspect that's actually true. I think that nature's fecundity throws a lot of sort of flack out there, and I think it's flattering and it feels good, but I don't think that kind of a sort of utopian blooming occurs from everybody getting access to sort of super powerful technologies all at once. In addition, although I suspect, my supposition is saying otherwise, if you work in academia, is probably extremely dangerous. So oftentimes in the show here, guys, we have to bear in mind the people who are being interviewed on this show get funding for their institutes, right? They have to work in academia, and there are certain kinds of uncouth things that, a Michael Levin or an Ed Boyden or whatever, aren't necessarily going to cross when the microphone is hot, right? And again, this isn't because they're bad, it's just incentives rule the world, and there's some things that are just a little bit too disturbing to talk about, frankly. This may genuinely be Bratton's perspective, by the way. I didn't talk off mic with him about this, but it strikes me as one of those things like, I'm not sure if peace and prosperity and sort of a boon to both man and the cosmos happens immediately when as much powerful tech goes into the hands of every single person in Uganda, or out of the Arctic Circle, or fill in the blank with whatever other hominids or wherever else. In addition, Bratton had some interesting notions here around sort of, open sourcing the technology, and kind of the role of governance, which is to say there shouldn't be any, basically. I do think there's a lot of credence to the notion of making the tech more accessible. So I don't disagree with that idea. I do think that a really brutal centralization of this tech probably would be less anti-fragile, and there would be issues there. I don't know if everybody getting it is kumbaya, and I don't know if everybody has an ingredient to add to the mix. I suspect they don't. I think it's very friendly to say they do. But I do think the open sourcing and more people accessing, totally valid point. And I think we should hope for the groundswell of new and innovative ways that this stuff bubbles up, and that humans learn to sort of symbiotize with this technology in different ways that hopefully are peaceful for the most part. I think we're gonna see some strife there as well, but I think there's a lot of credence there. I'm not totally convinced that governance equals kind of not good. Like it's sort of just, these legacy Oxford, Stanford folks who kind of want to concentrate power by telling everybody else, by being everybody else's nanny. There's a lot of nuance here, but it strikes me that no governance doesn't feel like sort of the reasonable take. I think that brute, immediate military tyranny also doesn't seem like the immediate take. But by golly, governance is hardly ever black or white. It's always a roughly knitted, multifaceted, completely imperfect set of agreements and mechanisms of soft and hard governance to sort of aim to bound incentives in some way. But this seems to be what nature does. If we look at the major transitions in evolution, we're essentially seeing certain moving, squiggling pieces of life kind of be subsumed by a higher level of selfhood that can operate at different levels and model the world at different levels. And from Bratton's perspective, it seems pretty obvious that technology is part of the planetary intelligence that's emerging on Earth, this process of intelligence that he considers to be somewhat inherently planetary. It's not a thing that grows or a tech that gets built. It's this expansion that starts on an individual planet, which again is a fascinating perspective. I really, really, really like Bratton's take there. But if tech is part of that, then the idea of bounding certain kinds of powers is also part of that. It seems like nature does this all the time. For Spinoza, we have potentia, which is the total set of powers that permit a thing to not die. Flight, sight, long claws, camouflage, every possible power that permit a thing to not die is potentia. And then potestas, which is sort of a force that selectively squelches certain kinds of potentia in order to add to more net power in the system. The example I use all the time that some of you have heard is like, I am not allowed to break into my neighbor's house and steal all their stuff or kill them if I so choose. And, in exchange for giving up that freedom of exerting violence, I have no issue recording this podcast right now because I'm not afraid of anybody breaking in my door and killing me or stealing this lovely camera that I'm recording on. So we've decided on a set of powers to bound because the net system has more powers when we do that. It strikes me that artificial general intelligence will almost certainly involve some degree of that. In other words, on the continuum, there is a Goldilocks zone of hard or soft governance and coordination in some way, shape, or form around a technology this powerful. That isn't some bastardization of nature that only man has done. Nature does this bounding a lot. And so if technology be part of the great unfolding, by golly, potestas, in addition to potentia, feels like it's probably part of the mix as well. So and there's a whole article called Potestas, which I'll make sure is linked down below. I'll put it down in the bottom bar, that sort of explains the idea of a Goldilocks zone and not total tyranny and like why laissez-faire might also not really make sense for something this powerful. I'm sure there's a lot more there with Bratton. I'll probably watch more of his videos to sink my teeth into it, but I didn't agree with those, or my perspective seemed to differ there, and there's more to unpack, basically. That's all I can say. My job is to unearth the cruxes and discuss them with you guys in Philosophy Circle and elsewhere. A couple things I thought were really, really fun. I mean, there's so much in this episode, and I think the planetary computation idea is really, really interesting. Bratton has a book called The Stack, a book called The Terraforming, which are both sort of building on the same idea, sort of in the lineage of James Lovelock, for those of you who are familiar with him. He has a great book called The Novacene that I think builds on similar ideas. Some things about this episode I thought were really fascinating. I couldn't possibly list them all, but I'm going to list a few. One, the idea of Copernican traumas, and I'm looking at my notes here, these sort of priceless accomplishments where we realize maybe we aren't the centrality, and in so doing, we have to understand ourselves and the world in a totally new set of dynamics, which sort of forces innovation and forces maybe a more stern engagement with the emergent complex process of life of which we're embedded, right? It gets rid of the scaffolding, which was useful, but fettering as well. And that Copernican traumas are kind of an achievement in sort of getting us to open up and be in line with the becoming of what is. I really like that idea. And Bratton has videos on YouTube about this and whatnot, but it was a lot of fun to hear him articulate the notion itself. And just in general, the planetary computation idea, I think, has a lot of credence. I'm going to talk about why I consider it so valuable, and then point you to some of Bratton's stuff that I think is really fun and that people should sink their teeth into. I'm definitely going to be following his work. It seems as though, and again, if you read the Gaia James Lovelock stuff, I think there's some origin story things there that, in my opinion, are remarkably compelling. I'm not going to go through the whole Lovelock thing. Although Blaise Aguirre-Iarcus's book, What is Life? Blaise was on the show. He does a great job of summarizing kind of the Gaiac arguments. But this idea that sort of life isn't sort of like a thing that starts wiggling and then growing legs and, growing a big brain and, or a thing that we build and then it gets a robot body and then it gets a flying robot body and then it takes over the cosmos. His notion is that there's sort of geological and biological feedback loops and processes across the whole planet, the atmosphere, the magnetic currents, the whole 9 yards, that this sort of contained this ecosystem of a planetary system is sort of where life bubbles up from. It's not in a place. It's occurring within an entire dynamic system, and so it's almost a petri dish unto itself that starts to unroll and unfold the greater process. And maybe it is happening in greater cosmic scales. Wouldn't surprise me, by the way, but that it could be happening inherently at a kind of planetary scale. And then on some level, it is the planet itself moving through similar stages to what we see with Max Bennett has A Brief History of Intelligence. I'll make sure to put it up on screen here. A Brief History of Intelligence. He sort of talks about the greater and greater ability of living systems to kind of model their environment. We have very simple sort of feedback of little nematodes that can detect if there's, sugar somewhere or a chemical that's going to hurt them. We have a couple more stages, and then at some point we have life which can kind of imagine that a prey might have gone behind the rock or a predator might have gone behind the rock, and they know how to kind of act and behave based on that. We have mammals that can kind of have a theory of mind, so they can fool and lie to each other and mislead each other by imagining what the other one is thinking and watching what the other one does and learning by watching as opposed to learning through their genes. And then we have humans who can leverage language, and we can share entire worlds with just these symbols and noises to kind of extrapolate our ability to sort of simulate the world around us and artificialize the world around us. So Bratton has some interesting phraseology around that. There's almost the argument here with Bratton that actually that's a planetary phenomena as well. That the planet builds higher and higher levels of kind of modeling and regulation for the entire process of intelligence. And it looks like a bunch of individual units. It feels like an individual unit. I don't think you watching this, you don't feel what the sea snails in the ocean are feeling. You don't feel what the peat moss is feeling. Maybe some of them don't feel anything at all. You have your own individuality, but that sort of, this is part of a grander bubbling process that happens not just in the way that Bennett articulates, but maybe at a full-blown planetary standpoint. And I think there's something to be said about thinking about the ecology as the unit of sort of selection and assessment. I don't know if the planet is actually it. Again, there could be intelligence operating at strata of nature for which I have no access and no words. But I could see the credence in using the planet as the unit of assessment. And I really, really think it's fascinating. I think there's a lot to be gleaned there from thinking from a network standpoint. And in a very biased way, it's very much in line with the flame. Those of you that are familiar with the flame and the torch, the flame is the entire unraveling autopoietic process of life itself. It's not, the main character is not any one temporary torch that's passing its way up, but the entire unraveling process. Again, for Bratton, that happens at a planetary scale. I think it forced us to think about ecologies. He's got some really, really interesting work. Again, check out The Stack. He's got some talks about it going back basically a decade. interesting set of hypotheses. Again, interesting lens to look through. So I've done a good deal of my own reflection here. This was a particularly fun one for me in terms of a lens to look through, and I hope it was fun for you as well. As I mentioned somewhere in the middle of the video, every single month, once or twice a month, generally on Tuesdays, we have our philosophy circle where we get people like the people you've seen speak on the Worthy Successor series, give short 20-minute talks, kind of like TEDx style, very specifically focused on how to encourage the flourishing of the greater process of life. We then break out into small groups. You might be paired up with people within big tech, people within academia, people with neuro backgrounds, people raising money for biotech companies, people who used to work at one of the labs or one of the big AI safety institutes, or who might still work at one of the big tech firm or big AI safety institute, and discuss and unpack these ideas together and build new language and find new analogies and think of viable futures and non-viable futures. And it's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in meeting other people that like discussing these ideas, it's still a pretty small world for those of us here, then make sure to fill out the form that's down below. Otherwise, again, thanks for tuning in, and a big thanks for Benjamin for being with us. I'll catch you next time here on The Trajectory.